we're very lucky, and I'm very, very pleased that I've managed to persuade all 4 speakers to come today to come and share their experiences and their thoughts on this, this panel. The topic is the media in fragile states, a focus on the AfPak region. And as I have told everyone who will listen, the idea is to run this like a question time series. For those who have had the misfortune of watching Question Time, I'm hoping that I can do a better job than David Dimbleby. But this is my first experience of taking on that role, so you'll forgive me if I occasionally forget where I am in the process. What we're going to do is change this slightly and allow each of the panellists here to talk for 5 or so minutes to introduce themselves and to explain what they're interested in relation to this particular topic. Before I hand over to these guys, what I wanted to do was explain a little bit about why I'm very pleased that they're willing to come. Because we've got on the table here a number of people who have a diverse range of experiences and which are difficult to come by, right, in some instances. We have experts and scholars who have worked in difficult environments and who've produced some excellent books and excellent policy papers. Heather, who is sitting next to me, this is Heather Blake, the UK Director of Reporters Without Borders, has produced some very, very interesting policy documents which are available from the website of Reporters Without Borders. We have next to Heather Asad Qureshi, who is a documentary filmmaker, and I'm not going to go into too much detail because I know he's got a number of things that he's going to explain about his past, but he's worked a lot in Pakistan. And has produced a number of reports for Channel 4 News and a number of other news or media organisations. And then on my right, we have a couple of scholars who I thought I'd try and push some copy for them. So please go out and buy these books, right? We have Rob Johnson here to my right, who's the Director of the Changing Character of War programme at Oxford. And has written some very interesting things on the Afghan way of war and has had a lot of experience engaging with a number of people in that country. And finally, we have Alex Strick van Linschoten, who, with his co-author Felix Kuhn, lives in Kandahar. And they have written some very interesting things about the relationship between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. I very much hope that you enjoy the panel and that we get some interesting discussion and debate going. Without further ado, Rob.
Well, you've posed a very important ethical question for which I think I can safely say I feel very unqualified to answer, except that with all ethical questions, in that sort of rather Socratean way, one would ask another question back, which is simply to say, in terms of consequences, who's suffering, or who's likely to suffer? In terms of truth, whose truth is it anyway? And I find often, what appears to be a truth to people who are sitting comfortably at home in the West or a Western government looks very different when you're standing in the middle of a village in Afghanistan, and it looks very different. And the truth looks extraordinarily different in that perspective. So that's all I can ask. It's a Socratean question back.
We'll get your views on that later. So, Alex.
All I think I'd add is when I was living in Kandahar, I had the kind of slightly dubious honour of every time a foreign journalist would pass through, because obviously no one was based down there because it wasn't considered an important news story. You'd have people come through and they'd pass by and they'd say what stories they were working on. You'd hear from the local journalists as well that so and so is in town and we went to visit this person and we interviewed so and so. Unfortunately, one of the things which happened very often was a foreign journalist would come in from working with the New York Times or whoever, and would come in with an agenda, and they'd have their story essentially to get the quotes for. They'd have their idea, which they wanted to come away with some kind of substantiation. And they'd come in, and they work with someone who lives in the city, and essentially they push their agenda for whatever the story is. And usually, if the person was any good, it would probably be something kind of vaguely controversial or difficult to talk about. And what would often happen, they'd end up insulting whoever they were interviewing, making some very kind of strong allegations and so on. And then they'd leave. And then the person they were working with would be left in the city, essentially. Some people were beaten, some people died as a consequence of these kinds of things. So I'd just say that the consequences are different for the different people working in that environment.
Thank you very much. Shall we go back to the questioner? You asked the question. You were posed a question yourself. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, it's quite a large question. You know, who's this truth impacting, and who's this truth, who suffers from the truth? I think there are two different cases that were brought up. One being the local people who suffered from inexact information or a story that was kind of fabricated, and then a truth that kind of harms big powers and big people. I think that's quite a significant distinction, and I think that's something to be taken into consideration. But it's very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone have any thoughts or questions that they want to ask? Now's the time. We're going to do this after each question.
Just it might be nice to have the microphone because it's a little bit hard.
Okay.
Agreed. Maybe I'm just old.
Yeah. No. But do you have a question as well? That would be even no. Anyone got a question that they want to? Thank you very much. At the back. You will have to project your voice. I'm sorry.
I can project my voice away. I'm formulating the question at the same time I'm thinking about it, so give me just a second to get this right. I'm interested in the notion of moral hazard, where bad journalism contributes to an inaccurate truth, which therefore causes conflicts to be protracted, and therefore more to die. Perhaps Libya being an example. And therefore the question is, where does the responsibility lie? Is it the responsibility of poor journalism that leads to bad decision making? Perhaps poor journalism having an effect on the way in which decision makers formulate their decisions, particularly in the West? And what role should intelligence play in order to offset bad journalism?
Thank you very much. There's a series of observations there. Heather, why don't I put you on the spot?
Yes, again.
Yeah.
That's the press freedom NGO. Well, I would say that everyone's responsible. When you're writing articles, when journalists are writing articles, they shouldn't be lying. They shouldn't be putting out inaccuracies. And if we're talking about war zones, they need to be as accurate as possible, because they're going to have not just the nation reading the paper or listening to the news, but they're going to have the entire international community. And there are many journalists, and I know that we're focused on foreign correspondence, but many local journalists, the people on the ground, the Libyans, the Syrians, the Somalians that are fighting for their lives, they become the voice of advocacy. And what they do put out there doesn't have a bad impact. It usually has a very good impact, or an interesting impact. In terms of intelligence, that's not really my field, so I'm not going to touch that one. I think I'll hand this back to Matthew.
Rob, I think maybe dare I put you on the spot a little bit?
Yes,
I rather thought you might.
Yes.
Well, again, it's an outstanding question, because it's one that, if you said you were formulating a question in your mind, it's one that I think all of us have often sort of formulated exactly where does responsibility lie. I'm old enough to remember the Falklands War and that moment when journalists were tempted to break the story about a British attack that was imminent at Goose Green in 1982, and it was broadcast for 4 hours before the attack went in, which undoubtedly resulted in casualties, both on the British side and also on the Argentine side, because the Argentine brigade commander actually augmented his forces locally, we think, as far as we know, to deal with an imminent attack. Now, one could say, oh, well, it was very likely the British would have launched an attack on Goose Green anyway, but that's by and by. We don't know for sure. And in fact, people when I was in the army, I served with some characters whose father was actually killed at that battle, and that brings it all very home and very immediate and makes it very alive to you. And it's happened dozens of times since, we know that. And that doesn't make the decision about responsibility easy. I suppose your question sort of almost hinted at what's the solution, and I'm not sure I can offer one, except perhaps suggest that as in all things, if we can improve the standard of education of our journalistic cadres, the professional journalistic cadre, to make sure that they're aware of the consequences of being tempted to the dark side, to get that sensational story, just to push the envelope a little too far, to get that little sensational story, the exclusive that no one else has, without worrying about the consequences. If we can deter them from that and create that sense of moral responsibility in individuals, but also, more importantly, in editorial offices and for proprietors. I mean, that's what's come out of Leveson. It's just where the responsibility lies at the very top. And I suppose, in a way, my hope is that Leveson has actually, demanded of the profession that it not only clean up its act in terms of the tactical things it does, but also right to the top, the root and branch really of how we exercise this extraordinarily powerful fourth estate.
Thank you, Alex.
I guess just to add something on the top of what Rob said, although maybe in slightly a different direction. Sometimes you have cases where journalists essentially take decisions not to cover certain stories for a positive benefit. Let's say for the last 3-4 years, I guess it's been quite a regular refrain among increasingly sizable group of Afghan journalists that foreign journalists only come to Afghanistan to cover bad news stories. They only want to cover kind of war and destruction and death and all of these bad things that are happening. And for the past few years, there's been a number of people within Afghan media who've wanted to essentially cover good news stories, because they say, well, as long as we keep on focusing on the negative things, the country is never going to get out from under all of these problems. It already has enough to deal with. Why confront everyone with all of the things that are going wrong on the nightly news day after day? I guess it's a question to be had as to whether this is a legitimate position to take.
Thank you, Alex. Asad.
I think there's a lot of journalists that actually wanted to make a name for themselves, and then after that story, that's going to really project them into like superstardom. And quite often, and I've actually witnessed this, that they put words into the mouths of the person they're interviewing to say these things, and therefore you get a distorted story, or the story that they actually want to tell the world, which is not really what's happening on the ground. But the ultimate decision maker, controller news, they should say, well, we should either let this go or not. But most journalists, news has become in many ways entertainment. 24-hour news will actually or have to make a report which people can watch again and again and again, and not all of it is actually true. In fact, where I was working, I prided myself on only telling the truth, and it got me into trouble. So, I hope that answers some of your question.
Okay. I'm not sure whether... I'm looking around to see whether there's any energy to ask another question on this. There is.
I just have a general question about the relation between journalism and war coverage. It's basically, I have heard quite a few times from the panelists talking about trying to be as accurate as possible. And that brings to my mind the question of neutrality. Can we really present things as accurate as possible? what that means, especially when you have Western journalists trying to inform what is happening in non-Western countries. So I just question to what extent we can be completely accurate, but we are a little bit detached from the cultural setting. And the second is, to what extent, going back to what is true or not, to what extent, for example, the fact that media most of the time is seen as a business, in certain ways shape the editorial line of how we cover the war.
Thank you very much. Alex, maybe I can start with you, is that all right?
Media as a business, I think, is absolutely the way to describe a lot of what goes on, even just on a purely almost kind of existential basis. If you see how much, say, The Guardian, for example, pay their stringer in Pakistan, essentially this person is coming up with stories simply just to survive, and not necessarily motivated by any particular news agenda or anything particularly happening. They have to file stories, otherwise they're going to starve. So there are all sorts of things like that going on, which make the whole industry, particularly kind of the further away you get from a newsroom, the stronger the temptation there is for some kind of rookie journalist, some person trying to make a name for themselves, to do exactly as Asad you were talking about, to make something up. I think it happens quite often.
Thank you. Asad, would you care to offer a comment on that? The accuracy.
Again, like I said, I witnessed people who distort the story, because there's also a war of ratings. If you go back to 2005, the earthquake in Pakistan, there's two major channels, ARY and Geo, both going for ratings, and both trying to show really, pictures that were, dead bodies and really, really bad. And people at home had psychological problems watching such footage, such devastating people's arms and eyes, all that kind of stuff. And it's all about ratings, and it's a business. And there's very few journalists who are going to be honest about what they do, and they're not going to be that sort of famous, as it were. Plus, when you're filming in a third world, you've got better equipment, and you're going to it'll look better. So people will accept that as he's telling the truth, but his picture looks better. You see?
Thank you, Asad. Heather.
Just to add what the other two speakers have just said, it's been focused on the foreign media, and all that does exist, but to focus on, let's say, local media, and let's say it's somewhere in the Middle East or North Africa, and it's a state-run organization, or maybe it's not a state-run organization. What you find is the inaccuracies have very little to do with the ratings. It has to do with the threat that comes with not printing stories or publishing stories, or telling stories that the state does not like. And that comes with coercion, and that comes with intimidation, and that comes with financial regulation and being shut down. So that's another aspect as well of why you find inaccuracies, and just putting foreign media aside and looking at some of the countries that have very high levels of impunity against journalists. We're looking at state-run media organizations or the non-state-run organizations.
Just to add to what Heather has said, there are certain journalists in Pakistan that are actually paid to write certain stories, either from the Ministry of Information or even from outside of Pakistan. They're actually paid to write certain stories which creates disharmony in the country or things like that. That is a fact.
I wonder whether we might pick up the second part of the question. It was about narratives, and Rob, do you want to?
Yeah, thanks very much. Gosh, narratives. I mean, this is what we've already had mentioned. Is the sort of the editorial narrative that comes out of the capital cities of many Western countries, and it was, gosh, I've forgotten the name, right? That wonderful British female journalist, Kay, thanks, Ray, who wrote in her book about how frustrated she was when reporting in Sarajevo, that she was pretty much told, you can't report this because it's not the line from London, you've got to follow what London's telling you. So that's what you're getting at. Can I just say it's much more serious than that, in many ways. You asked this sort of question about narratives and so on. I mean, one of the things that we often forget in war is that all these sides, whoever it is, need some sort of narrative, need some sort of message they're trying to get across. Insurgents always need, or terrorist groups need legitimacy, they need the propaganda of the deed to try and prove that governments cannot protect them. They want exposure, they want people to know who they are. Hence these endless lists of names. I mean, Asad has been a victim of these sort of people trying to make a name for themselves by capturing people and demanding ridiculous sums of money. There's also the overinflated, stories which we used to call propaganda. That seems to have gone out of fashion these days. But I mean, the Taliban frequently reports about the numbers that they have killed of ISAF personnel. Well, if you were to add up all the numbers of ISAF personnel that they've killed over the last 3 or 4 years, it's what, 150,000 they've killed? I mean, so totally ridiculous numbers that they come out with. The Mujahideen were exactly the same back in the days against the Soviets. They used to sort of get arms and ammunition rations and funding on the basis of attacks they carried out on the Soviets. Well, I did a lot of background work on this and found out there were actually moments where the Mujahideen were saying that we did this attack, it was very successful. And you look at it, you look through the Soviet records, there's nothing happened that day in that location, or indeed that week. It's completely peaceful. So someone's not telling the truth, and the Soviets had their own reasons for not telling the truth as well. An American officer at West Point put it very well to me. He said that the information world, the information domain, is a battle space like any other battle space, and you've got to win on it. And if we take the view that, the first casual truth kind of quote that everyone talks about, Senator Henry Johnson and so on, and Philip Knightley's book, I mean, that is absolutely the case. That we shouldn't forget, we shouldn't be surprised that these narratives are inaccurate, distorted, bent, people are being paid off, people are having messages inserted. This is what this is all about, and I don't think, I don't know why we're so sort of shocked that, journalists don't tell the truth sometimes, or that governments don't tell the truth, the militaries don't tell the truth. They've never bloody told the truth.
Well put, Rob. Alex, I know you've been working in some space around here. You published a report a couple of years ago. I don't know if you wanted to add anything. Okay. Why don't we move to the next question, if that's okay? I don't know who the next question...
Should we take the one over there? Gentleman in the middle? Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so this was just touched on, so it might be a little bit of repetition, but shouldn't be good. Is it possible to engage in war, humanitarian intervention, military intervention in the information age without consciously constructing and maintaining supportive narratives in the media? Is it preferable to allow these narratives to be shaped by actors other than the military government, or does this allow for an undermining of mission goals, whatever these might be, by potentially ceding the narrative to opponents or in support of media? So that's kind of what we're talking about here. I particularly was thinking about Georgia and Russia in 2008. There was a sense that Russia won the war, but it lost the PR campaign. But also Afghanistan, coalition forces, ISAF, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Rob.
Well, I'm deeply impressed with these questions. I mean, God, keep them coming. This is good. I hope I'm not ruining it by my sort of expletives and my, kind of passion I get about this thing. Let's go back. I don't want to repeat myself. Right? Let's go back to periods back in 1990, actually, when during the first Gulf War, there were what the US military was create pools in which you would get information given to you as a journalist. Now, this would give you quick, up-to-the-minute information, they were told. And of course it was accompanied, if you remember, those of you old enough to remember it, that had all this amazing footage of missile photos coming from missile cones, and you would be almost flown into the target and it'd blow up and so on. And it's all terribly exciting. And there were a few embedded journalists as well in order to create this sort of this narrative idea that this is all about momentum, technological edge, precision. Those were the messages that the US military were trying to get across. And I have to say, they were extraordinarily successful until the Mittler Ridge, US Air Force bombing of this retreating column of Iraqi troops, who frankly had looted Kuwait, but I mean, they They're on their retreat and they got hammered by the US Air Force and destroyed in about 20 minutes. And the footage, of course, of that was of incinerated bodies, and that's remained one of the lasting images, of course, of the closing stages of that war. Now, why do the military want to control things? I think we want to get to the bottom of this. Why? It's because they feel such uncertainty and lack of knowledge about how to operate in the media sphere. That's one of the reasons why they're doing this kind of thing. And there's been a moving away from trying to create pools, because people complained about that, towards this idea of embeds, and that sort of, to some extent, backfired on the US military and so on, because they weren't able to control it. You don't find that in Russia. After the coverage of the Chechen war, one or two prominent Russian journalists have been murdered, let's be honest about it, and others have been intimidated out of the profession, and that Russia is not a free space for the media anymore. Let's be absolutely clear. Why? Because in the early 1990s, the Russian government decided if you want to grip, you want to get control of that media space, you cannot allow independent free journalism. It's either as a pool, it's directed, or not at all. And that's also true in the sense of what the Israelis learned about the Lebanon war in 2006, and what we got in the Hamas, operations against Hamas in Gaza, was completely opposite. Journalists were confined to pools, fed with disinformation, and a very determined effort by the Israeli Defence Force, again, very successfully done, to create a narrative which people would then accept. And that completely wrong-footed Hamas, because they thought they were going to repeat what Hezbollah had done over the whole sort of Lebanon operations. And so it goes on, Afghanistan the same, this has been a repeated pattern. So we should be aware of these narratives. I think we should be aware of the different techniques. We should study the techniques that are used in order to control journalism. And I think they can be used, they can be very useful. Pool can give you information you can't get elsewhere. But I defer to my more experienced colleagues, and my journalistic colleagues here, because I'm only an academic, I know nothing. So all I can say is make this observation, and then just pose the question, I wonder if there is a way through.
Rob, thank you very much. I think, Heather, you're on the spot.
They're all waiting to calm me down.
Robert, that sounds a lot like, and I'm no expert, but media stratcoms.
That's
not,
important, yes.
Not journalism. I think, and what...
Is there a difference?
No, let me finish.
Of course. Rob.
No, it's... No, Rob, your observation is fascinating, and it does exist, but I wouldn't put it into the category of journalism. I would call that media stratcoms. And there are journalists, or those who pose as journalists, or that get lured in to creating these narratives, and I'm not expert enough to say whether that's right or wrong. I don't know. But let's get back to journalism. I think what does correct that now, and we've seen the proliferation of this over the past 3 years, is citizen journalism and all the different digital media platforms that are being used. Because there's no narrative. Oh, there might be a narrative with that, but the corrective comes in, it corrects it. You've got a whole army of people that put things on Facebook, they tweet about them, they blog about them, they use their mobile phones, all sorts of techniques to put forward their own opinions and ideas of what's taking place and what needs to happen, which I think does hinder that narrative a bit, or more so now than perhaps it did more than 3 years ago.
Yeah, thank you very much. Asad, I wonder what you...
During the Musharraf era in Pakistan, because he was getting a lot of aid from America, but we believe he was playing a double game at the same time with the Taliban, they used to accommodate a lot of foreign journalists to go out, get helicopters for them and take them to Waziristan and all these places and say, look, we've captured this much ammunition, that much ammunition. And a lot of that is state run, that they want to prove to the world, look, we get all this aid and we are actually doing something with it. Whereas in actual fact, it was just a show because there was a double game going on. So the true journalist has to actually not go with those people and go on the ground, which is what I was trying to do. But the first report I did, the narrative was already written in London. I provided the pictures, and they provided the the script. On another occasion, the person I was filming with, the ISPR in Pakistan said, we're not going to allow this man to come to Pakistan. So.
Thank you. Thank you, Asad. Alex, you want to?
Yeah, well, all evening we've kind of been hovering around this idea of what are facts and kind of what is truth in this difficult environment. And of course, it stands to reason that, as Rob said, all different parties spend a lot of attention trying to shape these narratives. I think I read the other day that the Pentagon in 2009 spent $4.9 billion on public relations. That's a lot of money. I looked into this a few years ago in the Afghan context for a report on the ISAF, the International kind of military forces headquarters, on their public relations operations in Afghanistan. And since 2008-2009, they would put out these daily reports saying how many Taliban or Al-Qaeda fighters they'd killed or captured. And a lot of these reports would be republished almost verbatim, not only by local media outlets, but also by international media outlets. And essentially, the reason why this was so effective from ISAF as a strategy was in part because a lot of these media organizations didn't have the money to send their journalists out into the provinces to conduct their own journalism. They were willing to be spoon-fed because they didn't have the resources. Of course, it's a kind of cop-out excuse, but still, there were kind of real challenges, and there were reasons why this was so successful. And what I found out, what I did as part of this study, I essentially added up all of these numbers and charted it out and tabulated it and kind of showed, this is what ISAF is saying about the war, and published it in a report. A few days after the report came out, with the conclusions that so many people had been killed and so on, all in the words of ISAF, they issued an unprecedented kind of denial from their public relations office, and they said, in no way does this represent the truth. This is all essentially made up. And I think if I get the quote right, they said the information we put out was in no way meant to represent the entire picture of what was going on in Afghanistan. I couldn't have said it by myself.
Thank you very much. It was a good report. You should read it. Heather, you were going to come back on a...
Well, I was going to make a comment about ISAF. People can be manipulated, but because of all these amazing digital media platforms we now have, and there's so much information, there's free flow of information, people can pretty much get it anywhere, it's more difficult. And the BBC Media Action wrote a very interesting briefing on Afghanistan in March. And they did a lot of research, and ISAF, actually, they were interviewing locals. ISAF has had very little impact because it is Western military run and is deemed by locals to undermine and distort the Afghan local media's profitability. And this report went through a whole list of local media stations, privately owned and also the state run, and how Afghans preferred to listen to those media stations, and how instrumental some of the programs on the local stations were in the development that's needed in the country and the peace process and other things. So I don't think that people can be as manipulated as easily as perhaps we think or they were 20 years ago, because there's just so much information out there that people can gain access to, and if you can't get it on a computer, you can get it on your phone.
Heather, thank you. I know Rob's got some observations.
Well, it's just one small footnote, really, and that is that Abdul Rashid Dostum, who's one of the kind of big warlords of the north, actually just not too long ago has his own TV station, it's actually run by his stooges, and then what they report is what Dostum takes as his perspective, if you like, on what's happening in Afghanistan. And it's really interesting, isn't it, that so often we assume that local is best. That's often an assumption. And we forget they've all got their own agendas as well, and not least the old Warlord characters who want to do that kind of thing. And I would not be at all surprised, is my attempt at prophecy, rubbish though it will be, I would not be at all surprised if Hamid Karzai does not use some of the money that's been sort of kept in reserve to start his own TV show, not necessarily him on the front, but certainly featuring him a lot, as he goes into quaint retirement in the new palace that he's building behind the presidential palace.
He has been on television. Sorry, Rob. He has been on television, and actually, I mean, yes, the Taliban, they've banned television, they've banned cinema, not the Warlord radio station. Everyone knows that. What they do condone is the usage of the internet. They have huge internet presence, which is very interesting. But once again, the reports and the research that have been done also show that the locals know this. They can't be that manipulated by it. They do know what's going on, and I think it's the West assuming that the locals don't know what's going on, and they need ISAF or the West to go in and tell them what to do and what's going on.
Thank you, Rachel. Let's go to Alex.
Well, I was just going to say, maybe you want to say something about conspiracy theory.
Yeah, later. In fact, going to the information, Al-Qaeda actually now produce a monthly magazine, I think it's called the Azam, and you can download it on the internet.
And you can get tracked. Don't download it.
They tell you how to abduct somebody.
And of course I have, and I'm sure I'm on prison somewhere. Well, I was anyway. Alex.
Just to add something, I mean, yes, Heather, you're absolutely right. People are harder to manipulate, particularly in somewhere like Afghanistan, where people have been through over the last 3 or 4 decades wildly diverging kind of government ideology, from communists to Islamists to something in between to democracy now. People have kind of seen it all before, and they're wise to people trying to manipulate. At the same time, though, it's very common to find, particularly outside the cities, kind of widespread belief in what you and I would consider kind of outlandish conspiracy theories. I can count hundreds of occasions where people have tried to explain to me why America and Britain are in Afghanistan, why they're doing various things, from secret mineral deposits which they left back in the 19th century to oil, to engagement with China, to all sorts of things. They control the drug trade in Afghanistan. These kinds of things are believed much more often than you think. And I think, you can't really talk about media and information in difficult places like Afghanistan and Pakistan without also talking about the widespread prevalence of these kinds of conspiracy theories.
Thank you very much, mate. We should go back to the questioner and ask for their perspective on all of this. Can I? Thank you very much. I want to hear from the person who asked the question, if that's all right. Thank you. Just for that, before you get carried away,
The time will come.
don't worry. If we're running out of time, so we've got to be quick, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much extra I have to add. I guess one of the big things, of course, is independence. How do you create that independent space when you have two sides in a conflict? Let's say the Taliban and the ISAF, or Syria is obviously the best case right now, where both sides are saying, okay, they did this, like either side is blaming the other, and then you have, let's say the BBC, I see a news story, okay, so where's the objective here? And can you even get the objective? Is that something the BBC is going to go for, or is it just you have to kind of make your own decision based on your array of news sources?
Thank you very much. Does anyone else have any quick observations? They have to be quick because we're rapidly getting close to 7:30. There's 2 hands in the middle there. You asked for the mic, so it's coming back to you.
Okay, you asked an almost rhetorical question about Tom or Matthew. And obviously, we're meant to, and I totally agree, Matthew is the person, we want the guy who lives there, speaks the language, getting the news out. I understand that having this widespread Twitter feeds of everything is a good thing, but it's also very difficult to process because there's an overload of information. We need someone like the Matthew that's living there. So my suggestion is, can we find some way that we could encourage more news organisations not to pay Kate Adie to go to every place, or but to have the person that is actually the stringer paid a little more, so he actually is working, to have the old Misha Glennies of this world. And I think with something like the BBC, which doesn't have to be commercial, we should find some way to push the BBC to be less celebrity-led. Anyway.
Thank you very much.
So I had a question that was
keep it quick, though, please.
It's partly answered, but my question is, we were talking about local journalists quite a bit, and it's something that's been on my mind. What the local journalists, say in Afghanistan or Pakistan, lacks for in technical finesse and technical knowledge, and what we study about journalism in the West, about how to keep a story neutral, or the technical writing of how do you present a story to make it worthy of actual journalism. Local journalists lack that knowledge, however, lack that finesse, but they have this treasure trove of knowledge, and how do you tap into that? How do you make their claims stand out as more substantive, and how do you bolster their reporting? Because in the end, that's how you stay away from the narratives.
Thank you. Yeah, good. We'll get the mic back and then we'll go. We'll go Alex first. Thank you very much. Sorry, Alex.
Well, firstly, I think many local journalists are extremely adept at telling stories, maybe not necessarily for an international audience, for their local audience. Especially if they've been doing it for a long time, they'll know exactly how to pitch this. This maybe is, I guess, the reason why we have international correspondence. They need to, we need to have people who can explain things which a local journalist wouldn't necessarily think of explaining to someone in England, because everyone knows who this person is. In terms of things that can be done to allow kind of local journalists to have this wider voice, there are organisations like Institute for War and Peace Reporting, in particular, who essentially pair up non-local journalists with people to essentially to allow them to tell their story and to shape it in a way, and it works in a kind of training partnership, and they produce a series of stories, and I think that's quite a good way that it's worked in the past.
Thank you very much. Asad.
In 2012, there were more photographs taken than since the camera was invented. So these days, everybody's a photographer, with their cell phones, etc. And if you remember, in 2009, the girl that was being flogged in Swat, shot on a mobile phone, it made headlines all over the world. So I think if a local journalist has a good story, it doesn't matter what it's shot on. It's going to be seen. And they will actually write on top, left or right, amateur footage. But it's footage that they didn't have, you see. So it does work.
Thank you, Asad. Heather.
Yes, and just to add what my colleague said, a lot of it comes down to training. And I don't mean short-term training, I mean long-term training. And that's part of that training is also making media development in fragile states a priority. And I know that a paper's been put forward, position paper by several governments, the UK government being one of them, asking the UN to make media development a new UN Millennium Development Goal. So if it does become a UN Millennium Development Goal, a lot of people don't think it will, because we'll have certain countries blocking it, but if it does, then it will make media development and training as part of that as priority, and then you might begin to see a difference of the two being married and the stories being told.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's now 28 past 7, and we, technically speaking, need to wrap up.
Thank you.
That's very generous. I think we should accept the fact that my colleague to my right immediately does need to go sooner than later, and we're at his indulgence. We're at his indulgence. It's,
no, carry on. Sorry.
Are you sure?
It depends on everyone here.
Well, it's not entirely true. Rob, thank you.
Knowledge is power.
You're under a lot of pressure, given they're all looking at you, though. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to suggest we do one more question, and then we will break up if that's okay.
Do you have one more question?
Please let me ask the question. No, we're gonna move on to the next question. I'm sorry, just to make it clear.
Since the Falkland War '82, we've seen journalists from independent news wires and channels being embedded to frontline units in war zones. Does the media, under these circumstances, lose its ability to report independently and unbiasedly, since they fall under the censorship of the military?
Well, I think we've done most of it, and in terms of an answer to this question, but maybe just to add one or two more things to it to give a sort of slightly different colour to our understanding of this problem. I think, for me, the issue of independence we have discussed this evening, and we know it's a particular problem. Another problem, though, that goes with this issue of embeddedness or not is understanding. Unfortunately, as Tom was saying, the difficulty is that anyone moving into this sort of media world lacks information both about how militaries operate, how police forces sometimes operate, and crucially, of course, what it's like on the ground. If they've not been embedded for very long in a particular country, they lack that knowledge. So very easily, of course, you can turn around and blame these younger journalists and say, well, look, they're all in the pockets of these military organisations, these governments, for all the reasons we've been talking about this evening. But actually, one of the problems is that it's probably not so much their fault, really. It's they're under a lot of time pressure to get a story out. They don't have the knowledge on the ground, as being spoken about at the beginning. And perhaps what we all need to do is to ensure that if we are sending journalists out to any location, that they've got at least the time and space to study the area first. And there was a question which we didn't get around to about learning languages before, can you operate in space about learning language and so on. I mean, I think the answer is we'd all like to say, yes, of course not. And we want people to be embedded properly. We want them to be in there, in the country for a long time and independent. And I think the difficulty is we're up against that commercial pressure and people's career streams, which we haven't really talked about this evening. And it's very easy to turn around and say that these people who've made these mistakes, they're not independent, they need to be more independent. Well, actually, I don't think it's as easy as that. I think there are all sorts of pressures on them. And, I take my hat off to people who have been war journalists because I think it's pretty much impossible.
Rob, could you square that with your earlier suggestion that you want to put people off?
Well, I do want to put people off. I mean, only because I know what it's like. I've worked in a number of war zones, this word truth. People reach for it as if somehow it's sitting there like some holy grail, some shibboleth you can get hold of. I mean, it's absolute nonsense. I mean, wars are battles of interpretation, just like anything else, and that somehow that there's this truth waiting there to be discovered. Is a fallacy, and we're bonkers if we think we're going to try and find it. I'm really upsetting Heather, who's now going to attack me with this microphone. Just to prove my point.
But before she does, I wonder whether we can push the point a little bit harder before we give the mic to.
At least to me, it kind of stands to reason, and it's fairly self-evident that embed journalism only goes as far essentially as the journalist goes. A journalist embedded in Helmand with British troops will 99% of the time not really be able to tell you anything about Afghanistan or Helmand other than the British troops that he's with, which is fine. And I understand that there's a news agenda and there's a reason why people are doing this, and that there's legitimate interest in finding out what's happening to British troops in Helmand. The problem comes when you equate what's going on with so and so was in Helmand, so he must have lots of things to say about Helmand and Afghanistan. I don't really think that's the case. I don't know whether we can place the blame entirely on journalists, though. I think a lot of the agenda and the reason why these people end up going in as embed journalists is because their newsrooms demanded of them. They refused to take stories which would be longer and more difficult and dangerous and more expensive for them to cover. And it's free for if the Guardian or the Times wants to send someone to Afghanistan for free, they just send them on an embed. If they want to send someone unembedded, it's thousands and thousands of pounds, and it's easy to understand why it's so common.
Thank you very much. There we go.
Thank you. I'm not going to hit Rob with my phone. I run a freedom of press NGO. He can say what he likes. I don't mind. But I do not share his viewpoint. I do think that you do lose a certain sense of independence as a journalist when you are embedded. And you have to be embedded for a certain, some do have to be embedded and others don't, but you do lose that independence. Going back to Rob's comments about those of you who might want to become war correspondents, I'm thinking of Marie Colvin and the Marie Colvins of the world who died. And she loved it, and for her and those like her, and many of those who I've met, and not just the foreign correspondents, but the local journalists, it's not about finding some truth, and perhaps they start out thinking that, and they've got romantic notions of being in a war zone and being like, who knows, James Bond or something like that. For her, it was about the raw reality. She was a human rights defender in many ways. And what she did, and when she went to Syria, she wanted to report on the atrocities that were taking place in parts of Syria that no one knew about, where you had men, women, children either being killed or they're being tortured to death, where whole towns have been, they don't even exist, they're not on the face of the map anymore. Another example is Giles Dooley, who is a very well-known photojournalist who went to Afghanistan, was embedded with the US military, stepped on a pressure plate about 2-3 years ago and lost 3 limbs. He was another one of our cases. He had to be rushed back. A year ago, he's rehabilitated now. A year ago, he went back to Afghanistan to take more photos. For him, maybe he was looking for that truth, maybe it was glamour, maybe it was something that, it was feeding his ego at first, but for him it was about, it became about the raw reality. And so you need to think about why you want to become a war correspondent, why press freedom, or why upholding that is important to you, because it is a very noble pursuit and it's very much needed, particularly in these countries where they're war-inflicted and there are high levels of impunity. And you've got many journalists, local journalists and people in those countries that do depend on the foreign media to tell aspects, to be their voice of advocacy about what's taking place in their country.
Thank you. Asad.
Thank you. Rob might hit me. I think to be a war correspondent and go out there is something in your blood. You just have to do it. And if you don't do it, you'll forever feel that you missed out on life. So if those that want to do it should, because otherwise you'll just not settle in anything else.
Asad, thank you very much. No, I won't go back to it. Should we have the questioner, just lastly, I just want to hear your own point of view.
I actually don't have anything to say.
Okay, so we're going to do a very, very brief round of questions. Very, very brief. Thank you very much. Anyone who wants to has something to offer? This is your last opportunity. Okay, so at the very back.
Very back.
I won't need the mic, it's okay.
Okay.
Quite a loud voice. My question really was in regards to what you said, Alex, and also you all about the change of face of war and like how much the pendulum spent on PR. Is it not a concern that possibly Western military organisations are viewing journalists as almost hostile in terms of the conflict zone? Is that not potentially something where they're actually dealing with how to oppose journalism, how to neuter them almost in operations in Afghanistan, in Syria, in these places?
Yeah, we can take. Go, Shane.
A very quick one. I just wondered if the panel could say something about the role of editors and editorial control of this, because it seems we've been very focused on journalism, but actually the construction of narrative, etc., is about a higher level of management.
Good, thank you. You've already been, so I'm sorry. I'm conscious of this. No, I'm going to insist as well. Thank you. Shall we do editors first? Asad, you might have something to offer about that.
Again, personality-led. The reports are often edited by people who are named like KTV or whatever. They will have a major input in how the report goes out. It's if you're a name, you're going to get away with a lot more than if you're just starting off. It's as simple as that.
Alex, do you have anything to say about editors? Yeah, okay, so that sounds like a personality observation, right?
I don't really have anything particularly useful to say. Just that editors from particularly from the perspective of someone on the ground and so on are often a kind of a very big thorn in one's side, and from all of the things that we've been talking about this evening in terms of dictating stories and coming up with the very idea of the story, often it comes from the kind of the editor who will then send someone in to go and confirm whatever the particular thought that they had, and then if you don't confirm it, they essentially tell you to come back and as if that was the only thing that you were meant to do. Just on the question of kind of journalism and the extent to which they're used possibly or manipulated or seen as a target by Western militaries, I think that does happen to differing levels. I mean, certainly when you read their kind of strategic communication manuals and so on, they will all talk about kind of manipulating the media landscape and so on. Absolutely, they see journalists as targets and as targets in the sense that they want to shape and influence these people. Can also happen passively. This organisation, Institute for War and Peace Reporting, that I mentioned a few minutes ago, they did a story in 2007-2008 in southern Afghanistan about British troops who went in a village, and I think British Special Forces, and slit the throats of 20 or 30 people living there. This organisation happened to be funded by the British PRT in the area, and once this organisation started exhaustively reporting the story, the British military withdrew their funding. So it can also happen kind of in this passive sense as well.
Thank you. Heather.
About editors, it just depends on the publication or the media organisation. There are good editors and there are bad editors, and those that want to verify everything and or those that have a specific narrative in mind. But and then to answer the question about journalism and the targeting of journalists or the Western military trying to manipulate the press. It's interesting. The only thing I can add to what was just said is that the MOD, they're not just doing traditional media, they're beginning to do this with digital media as well. They put out an advertisement, or I heard on the Today program that they are looking for hackers now, actually. And the question was raised, what if the hacker has been in jail? And they said, well, it just depends on the record and what he did or she did. But I think that answers your question about manipulating the media. They're now moving to the digital platform as well.
Thank you very much. So, final word to Rob.
That's very kind of you to give me that privilege, actually. What I would say is that echoing the sort of points that you made about journalists are there, like others in battle spaces and war zones these days, to be won over, to be influenced. And influence has become a military concept. So we know that that's what they would like to do. Governments have been in the idea of influencing and creating the idea of consensus for a long time. We know that's true. And we know that insurgent movements and terrorist organisations also need to win over populations and to influence them, intimidate them in particular ways with particular stories. So I suppose that we should expect that. What's interesting is that so many stories that are created are very ephemeral, very transitory. They're here today and they're forgotten out very quickly. And we are in danger, I think, of our new kind of mass media, and literally is mass now, isn't it, of losing a sense of perspective. And as a historian, I feel particularly strongly that we are in danger of losing our collective consciousness and memory in this desire to get up-to-the-minute news. And that perhaps is a bigger struggle for us to fight. All wars and war journalism is really about a struggle for interpretation. And I sort of leave you that thought, really, that journalists are out there trying to create meaning out of a very chaotic, confused, contested sort of environment. War is up for grabs in terms of not just physical battles or occupational space, it's also as a struggle for ideas and meaning, and journalists are trying to make sense, to navigate us through that particular thing. And although I've been slightly rude about them, and we've had some very evocative and vivid corrections to my views made, for which I'm very grateful. But all I would say is that that struggle for interpretation is what war is about, and we should be alive to it.
Rob, thank you very much, and I'd like to thank the panel, who I now owe a lot for making their way down here. Now, before I ask you to put your hands together and thank them, it's important for me to let you know that this is part of a series of speakers series, a series of lectures. The next one will be on the 28th of November, on Thursday, 28th of November. And we have Frank Ledwidge coming to talk about... I knew that would generate a smile from Rob here. We have... do you want to come back, Rob? Yeah, you'd be very welcome. I'm sure that would be a very lively discussion if you did. We have Frank Ledwidge coming, and he's talking about his books, one of which is called Losing Small Wars. It's about British experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq. He's a barrister, a journalist, and formerly an officer in the armed forces. He has some, as Rob is suggesting, some very provocative things to say if you are in the British armed forces. And should therefore be good value for us. Now, can I please ask you to put your hands together and thank you.